like to welcome our viewers to another episode of Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified anomalous phenomena and close encounters experiences. The series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am your host, Kimberly Engels. So I am very excited about my guest today, Dr. Richard Haines, who is a former government senior research scientist. And so, Dick, just first of all, thank you so much for being here with me today. I really appreciate it.
Kimberly, it's my pleasure, and I've been looking forward to this.
All right, me too. Absolutely. So so the viewers can learn a little bit more about Dick. Um, Dr. Haynes received his BA degree in psychology from Pacific Lutheran College in Tacoma, Washington, and his MA and PhD degrees in experimental psychology from Michigan State University in 1962 and 1964. He's received a National Research Council postdoctoral resident research associate at NASA's Ames Research Center from 1964 to 1967, where he continued investigating the theoretical and applied dynamics of light scatter within the human eye. During that time, he designed and directed construction of NASA's High Luminance Vision Laboratory, the research from which contributed to applied knowledge directly related to America's Gemini and Apollo lunar missions. After 3 years, he became full-time government research scientist in 1967 with the biotechnology division at Ames and directed a broad program of psychophysiological and psychophysical research over the years. In 1986, he was appointed chief of the Space Human Factors Office, where he directed various human factors projects related to design of the International Space Station, including NASA's Orbital Proximity Operations mock-up and its windows. He retired from government service in 1998 as senior research scientist to pursue other lines of research, including multimedia communications, evaluation of algorithms, to compress CCD imagery return from Galileo's spacecraft camera, remote coaching techniques for for space life sciences, and more recently, helping to develop and operate state-of-the-art, full-scale, virtual reality air traffic control tower simulator at Ames. He was previously assistant professor of psychology at San Jose State University after retirement and has published many peer-reviewed journals, NASA and FAA technical reports. He holds 4 U.S. patents and has been a member of Sigma Chi Aerospace Medical Society, Optical Society of America, and numerous others over his career. So I know that that was a long bio, but Dick has a very long and established career here, and I wanted to, highlight some of that for our viewers. Dick, before I dive into some of the questions that I have for you today, I always do just a little review of phenomenology for viewers who might be joining us for the first time and for the guest as well.
Mm-hmm.
So phenomenology is a philosophical method that's rooted in the rigorous examination of first-person experience and consciousness. So Edmund Husserl was the founder of phenomenology, and he advocated a method of bracketing in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with and describe exactly what appears. So while the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed, what they felt, what they formed judgments about, and how they integrated this into their experience of themselves, of others, and the world. So, given that robust background that or that introduction to you and your career, my first question for you, Dick, is, what actually over the course of your career, what got you interested in the issue specifically of UAP? And your research is really about UAP has been in relation to aviation safety. So, tell me a little bit about the journey of what brought you to your interest in those subjects.
Mhm. Okay, I'd be delighted. Um, I have to admit that I began as a skeptic, as a confirmed scientist, trained and experienced in science, no, I would say hard science, social science. Um, I had a vision laboratory long ago when I first started that I could recreate the way objects would look to the astronauts in outer space. Um, and in the process of doing that, I was able to fool people. I could set up an optical situation that looked very different than reality. In other words, the perceptual processing of that stimulus, uh, because of light scatter in the eye, particularly, um, I could make a triangle, for instance, appear an equilateral triangle. Can you see this? My hands? Okay. That equilateral triangle would appear as a circle because of light scatter within the eye. A, a rectangle, let's say a 6-to-1 rectangle with straight edges, would look like a hot dog because of light scatter. It would fill out, if you will. Well, I said to myself, gee, if I can do this in the laboratory, then UAP must clearly be just misidentified natural phenomenon. So that, from a skeptical point of view, that made sense. It wasn't until I started talking with pilots who came into NASA Ames, which is in California, by the way, near San Francisco, and talking with them, we would hire them to fly our flight simulator. We have a 720 simulator at that time. And for other aeronautical reasons, I must say, I would ask them afterward to come in back into my office and we'd have a chat. And once in a while, I'd have the opportunity to ask them, have you ever seen anything in your career that you couldn't identify? And most of them would say, no, no, I know what you're talking about. And no, I haven't. But once in a while, somebody would. But they said, if I tell you any of the details, you have to promise you'll never disclose my name. So, at any rate, that was the beginning of the process of confronting me with a whole new set of data that I had to cope with. From a psychological point of view, I didn't want to do that because I was kind of confirmed that I was on the right track with my close minded, non scientific, it was scientific supported only as far as I'd gone. But from a true science point of view, I had to go further. And that's what I ended up doing by interviewing these pilots. Okay. And they would tell me these wonderful stories about flying a commercial plane or whatever on commercial business, cross country, for instance, and having the phenomenon come alongside their wing or stay in formation directly in front of them, which is not a good idea at 400 miles an hour or whatever. So, at any rate, that was the process that I had to go through. It was an emotional process. It was a necessary process. And anyone who wants to be a serious investigator in this area has got to be given the flexibility, the capability of not locking themselves in along this spectrum, the spectrum of belief and disbelief, for instance, or skepticism and acceptance. And as the years went by and I got more and more interested in this, I said, well, we need to do something that's practical for the American people. That our studies of UFO, UAP phenomena so far have been pretty self-oriented because of curiosity, for instance. An investigator has curiosity. Okay, well, they can satisfy that curiosity, but does anybody else benefit from it? The few that do benefit are usually the magazines with strange stories in them, or perhaps Hollywood, who gets an idea for a new movie or whatever. But by and large, the general public may be interested in this subject, but there's no genuine benefit. So I'm jumping ahead now many, many years to about 1999 when I helped develop an organization called NARCAP, those are the initials, National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomena, with Ted Rowe, a young man at that time who had a lot of interesting experiences himself and wanted to work with me on this organization to provide a call-in center, a reporting center for pilots, any pilots, military, commercial, private, test pilots, balloons, it didn't matter. If they had an experience they wanted to report without losing their job, then we provided that center. And I won't go into details. Our website is still there, narcap.org, O-R-G. I'm no longer with NARCAP. I had to step down about 3 or 4 years ago. But nonetheless, it was a way to make ufology, the serious study of UFO phenomena, practical to the American flying public. Who wants to fly across the country on an airline that runs into these things, or has a flight crew up front who isn't trained to deal with them? You see, that's practical because so many people are flying these days. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I think what you created with the NARCAP website was very important because, for a long time, so many people think actually that, UFOs or UAP are kind of like a joke, and that I remember actually I even posted something once about specifically about flight safety and individuals who had seen or pilots who had seen UFOs or something unidentified out the window that had interfered with the flight. And there were people who were like laugh reacting to it on social media because they thought that I was joking by posting it. And you, so it brought a level of, I think, seriousness, but also just awareness, right? Like this is a real issue. If you're flying through the air in a craft and there's unidentified objects around you, and again, the crew or the pilot may not know or exactly how to respond to that, that's an issue of public concern, right? And so I think this question that you had, or this goal of how do we practically benefit, right? This is happening and people need to know about it. How do we produce some good or some awareness? And I think that NARCAP has been very successful about that. When I was preparing for this interview, I looked at the site, I looked at some of the cases and the reports and the analyses that are there. And it's, first of all, it's very rigorous. It's very objective. It doesn't make any wild claims about what these objects are. It just describes what appears, right? And I saw that as actually very in line with phenomenology, because phenomenology is about examining what appears in the lived experience of the witness without necessarily jumping to any conclusions. You don't have to say, oh, that must be an alien spacecraft, or that must be anything else. It's just, okay, no, we're just describing what the object was that they interacted with. So I saw, when I was reading those reports on the NARCAP site, a lot of it was very aligned with the phenomenological method. But let me ask you, so when we're talking about just UAP research in general, or UFO research, the question of witness testimony is kind of always in question. And even as you were saying at the beginning, our senses can be deceptive sometimes. Sometimes, something looks like a circle when it's really a triangle, or there's just a lot of ways that we can be deceived in terms of what we're seeing, or memory can be we can misremember things and stuff, and things of that nature. um Pilots I think, and I'd like to hear your view, I think that they are very credible and reliable witnesses, at least in terms of seeing things in the air. So, can you just tell me a little bit about, why you take these pilot reports so seriously? Like, why do pilots make very credible and reliable witnesses in general? Like, why is
Mhm.
this testimony that we should pay attention to?
That's a great question. That's a fundamental question. Because if I can answer that one way, then I could talk about policemen. I could talk about a lot of occupations with a lot of responsibility, and they're seeing these things as well. So let me take a cut at that. I'll be the first to admit that pilots are human. They've got eyeballs that can scatter light. They can be fooled. They've seen mirages. They've seen weird sights in the sky that they can't explain. And so they're human, just like everybody else. And so I admit that from the very beginning. Pilots, because of, for some reason, they're being called into this profession, which is a very responsible position, to fly an airplane, often with passengers, not always, but very often, which means they're motivated to get educated. They have to have flight training on a whole lot of practice in different circumstances, winds and engine problems and communications breakdown and so forth. Well, so they have coping capability. They have to be intelligent. They have to be educated. They have to be able to handle stress, sometimes very high levels of stress. They have to make good decisions quickly. Um, they're flying in a vehicle, an airplane that is under their control, which means that they can change the attitude of the airplane, the altitude, the location of that airplane to put the phenomenon against a different background. So, for instance, if the UAP can be seen against the Earth background below them, because they're at a higher altitude, they have an absolute range to work with. That object or phenomena cannot be any further than 30 miles or 2 miles or whatever it is. Um, they have a radio on board. They can contact authorities on the ground, air traffic control usually, and ask for radar confirmation. And sometimes they get it, but very usually they don't, which is part of the puzzle here. They are flying an airplane that has a lot of electronic instrumentation on it, sensors, let's call them, very sensitive sensors. There's a magnetometer on there. There's radio frequencies. There's radar on board, forward-looking radar, and so forth. There's direction finders. And so they're really flying in kind of a laboratory. And if they're looking at those instruments, or somehow the readout from those sensors, airplane sensors, are being transmitted to the ground, which some of them are, then we have more physical evidence. And I could give you a number of interesting stories of pilots who had close encounters with compasses deviating automatically or unexpectedly. That's pretty serious. You don't want to be flying in your airplane when you can't count on your compass and so forth. So that's kind of a broad brush view of the the position that the pilot is coming from when he unexpectedly encounters one of these or more than one of these phenomena.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. And again, this isn't just any old person walking around on the street as you're talking about. This is someone who's highly trained in terms of what to look for, and has the ability to communicate with others about what's going on in their surroundings. So it lends just this lens of credibility to this testimony, and I think makes it extremely important. So, um, you said you have some stories. What are some of the most common characteristics of the UAP phenomena that are observed, and especially what leads them to the conclusion, in particular, that this was something anomalous, right? That this was not necessarily just a human-made object or a natural object, but something that truly kind of meets that category of anomaly.
Okay, yeah, another good question. Let me just say that in general, the phenomena, whatever it is evidencing characteristics of curiosity. This is a human characteristic. What do I mean by that? That I have many cases where the pilot is on autopilot. You know what that means? Okay, for some viewers may not understand, the airplane's flying by itself. Nobody is controlling the direction, the bank rate, the descent rate, or whatever. It's going from point A to point B. Well, unexpectedly, something shows up, comes alongside or maintains some position with the airplane, and doesn't do anything else. It's just kind of like he's checking the airplane out.
Hmm.
And so in some cases, the pilot will wiggle his wings out of curiosity. Usually private pilots might do this. Commercial pilots, not so much. But in an attempt to, I think, find out if there's a response from the phenomena, he wiggles his wings like this. And in some cases, the phenomena, after a little delay, wiggles its wings or whatever it's got,
Sure.
whatever shape it is. That to me is very significant. And that was what we call a close encounter of the fifth kind. That's human initiated contact. And just so you know, I don't know if you can see this or not.
I can, yeah.
You can, okay. Can you see the top, the eyes?
Yes.
You can, okay, good. This is a book I wrote, 1999 it came out, of 242 cases around the world where not just pilots, but people on the ground, in boats, anywhere practically, were deliberately trying to communicate or to respond, not respond, to get a response from the phenomenon. I'm getting a little bit off track here, I understand,
Okay.
but I think it's relative. And in 242 cases, which I was really surprised to find in the literature from around the world, the phenomena responded back. Now think about that. Then the next question I asked in this whole data set, that what's the nature of the response?
Right.
The first chapter deals with friendly human behavior. That means you're out at night walking your dog after dark and you have a flashlight. It's a clear night and you see a light in the sky that shouldn't be there, so you flash your flashlight at it, some code, let's say, and you're surprised to see a code coming back. It's not just a solid light anymore. It's coded, if you will. Or again, a pilot flying along and wiggling his wings, and then the object wiggles. Or the second chapter was on aggressive human behavior. Think about that. And so a hunter is out hunting in the forest one day, and he sees an object hovering in the sky nearby, and he shoots at it with his rifle. Lots of cases like that. Bow and arrow, archers have done this. People tried to throw rocks at them. Missiles are fired from ground, surface to air missiles trying to hit them. This is a human behavior.
Right.
Think about that. You can say that that's done out of fear, not maybe curiosity in some cases, but certainly not the aggressive ones, but usually fear.
Right.
The question then is, what is the response of the phenomenon to that human behavior? Well, in the bottom of this book, the end of the book, what the reader will find is what I think is marginal evidence. It's not strong evidence yet. I don't think the database is big enough yet. Marginal evidence that there's intelligence behind the phenomena. And that's a key question. That's a driving, fundamental, philosophical, psychological question. Is there intelligence there? Then the question is, who it is, where are they? Is it a drone being operated from some other location? Or is the intelligence all on board?
Right.
You understand? Yeah, I
Yeah,
hope that
absolutely.
answered the question a little bit.
No, it does, right? It does, because if there's a response coming back,
Yeah,
if there's a communication initiated on behalf of, as you say, the pilot or the individual, and there's a response coming back from the phenomenon, again, that suggests, and you're very cautious in your language, and I appreciate that. You say, that's at least marginal evidence that there's some kind of intelligence behind these UAP. Now, again, we can't jump to any conclusion necessarily about who or what that intelligence is, right?
right,
It's not just it's not just a natural object, because a natural object, wouldn't respond to the human attempts at contact.
right.
Um, we're deviating a little here, but I'm interested in those cases of the firing, the shooting the rifle, or shooting the missiles. What is the most common response of the phenomenon when the
Yeah,
aviation is aggressive?
yeah, and it goes back to your previous question, and I said curiosity. I would say self-control, because
Yes.
when shot at, they do not shoot back.
Okay.
Now, there are documented cases of like a laser beam coming down, and some people claim to be paralyzed. I think that could be simply defensive on their part to stop being shot at. That's not a bad way to do it, just to paralyze the person for a while. Doesn't kill them. I don't know of any cases where people have been killed in this kind of encounter. Um,
And
it's a
the
fascinating,
paralysis is temporary or permanent?
just temporary.
Temporary. That's
Just
what I thought.
and I have to acknowledge the work of Stephen Greer, Dr. Stephen Greer, who established many years ago now an organization called CSETI,
Right.
and it is based upon the CE5 approach of the humans should be much more overt rather than passive. And Americans, human beings on
Human
this
beings.
planet have been quite passive.
Hmm.
And so the CE5 approach is more active, proactive, let's say. Um, so I just had to get that in there because he has turned the corner. And he's a very controversial man. I
Right.
understand
Yeah.
that, but maybe all of us are. I don't know, because science hasn't progressed far enough to accept this as a new science.
So I think that's a good jumping off point to my next question. The scientific method in its purest form, it wants things that are observable and, controlled, or sorry, observable and somewhat repeatable under like the controlled conditions. And usually, eyewitness testimony is not considered scientific evidence. There's just too much room for error and things like that.
Right.
Why do you think it's important that when we're studying UFOs and UAP that we can't just do, the instruments and the nuts and bolts alone? Why do we need the witness testimony too? Why is it important that that's included?
Gee, another good question.
I'm glad you like my questions.
I do. Let me try to answer that from the standpoint of photographic evidence, which
Okay.
I've done quite a bit of analysis with photographs. And I've maintained for a long time that no photograph is worth anything without a great deal of knowledge about the camera, the film, the processing, but even more importantly, the person who pushes the shutter on
Yeah.
the camera. their background, their beliefs, how proficient they are in setting the camera up in the first place, their memory of the event, or lack of memory for that matter. That the eyewitness testimony that accompanies the photograph is essential, absolutely essential. And as I've said other times and places, I will not accept a digital photograph anymore for analysis. It's off. I won't waste my time for obvious reasons. But I have a number from the past of very impressive film photographs that let me go down to the grain level, usually color, sometimes they're black and white, down to the chemistry of the grain that carries information. All right. So anyway, I guess that's how I would answer your question. That testimony is essential. Now, it is open to a lot of criticism, and I have to show you another book that I did some years ago, 1980, I think it was. Can you see this?
I can, yeah.
Have you seen it? Have you heard of it?
This one
Yeah.
I've not heard of. I'd heard of your other one, but not this one.
Okay. Well, this was done 19, what did I say? 80, I think it was.
Okay.
I edited this book, and it's a collection of articles or chapters from all kinds of social scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists. There's a human factors person in here, and so forth. Why? Because way back then it was obvious that the testimony was being attacked by the skeptic. And the skeptic was getting away with it.
Right.
As we both understand.
Absolutely.
But buried within the testimony has to be some truth.
Right.
Then the challenge is pulling what is truth and what is not truth from the testimony. This phenomenology that you talk about is essential. It's absolutely essential. So that if a pilot comes forward with a story, he may or may not have physical evidence in the cockpit. There may not be radar contact with the phenomenon, but he's got his memory. And I'll tell you, when they have a close encounter at 30,000 feet and cruise altitude, cruise speed, their life is never the same. They're coping with a whole new reality, and they go into denial many times. And I think I would too. It's a frightening experience. And I could tell you stories of that nature as well. So there's a psychological component, an emotional component, which is very important for social scientists to get involved and to contribute in that area. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, and I'd like to follow up a little bit on that. If the kind of the aftermath of this experience for the pilots, right? What their lives are like in the aftermath. So, can you tell me a little bit? You know, maybe they have an emotional response to what they saw, but also I think they face the potential of a lot of stigma. Also, as you said, they when you ask them about it, they say, well, I'll only tell you if you don't tell anyone else, because I think that pilots could face a lot of career repercussions for reporting these types of things. So, what are some of the things that in the aftermath of an encounter like this, because I agree it's not just what they see, it's going to affect their lives going forward. What are some of the things that pilots deal with in the aftermath of this kind of sighting?
Well, I think it's probably the same kind of aftermath that anybody else would feel. But layered upon that is their career. They want to keep flying. And as you've said, they are facing censure and denial and threats, if you will. To put it very boldly, some are threatened with their jobs, or they're required to go see the company psychiatrist, which goes on their record, and so forth. So that's the overlay. But underneath, they've got to live with this reality It's a new reality you've never had before, which is the same thing for a person on the ground. So I'm not sure we could really make much of a distinction here between pilots and everybody else. Um, to me, from a safety point of view, did they fly the airplane any differently afterward? Did they learn something from this experience that improved safety? Or in some cases, did the emotional component reduce safety in some way? And I hope that's not the case, but it's a possibility. So curiosity is certainly a big factor. Some people are more curious than others. And so you have to factor that individual difference into the response. By and large, I have to say that the commercial pilots I've interviewed over the years are very mature, very competent, and self-controlled. You might call them type A in some cases, just to be a good pilot. And that's probably true. But many of them are very sensitive to reality. And facing a new reality, of course, is really a stress until you bring one into the level of the other of reality. If this is what you've always believed, and suddenly something happens that's up here, you got to deal with the difference. And so, how do you bring it down? Many of them bring it down, I think, by going in the literature on the internet and look at YouTubes and other stories that people have had with their own encounters, so that they can say to themselves, gee, I'm not so out of balance as I thought I was. I'm probably a little more typical. And in that regard, fortunately, our government is beginning to change directions in the right direction, as far as I'm concerned, and to take this much more seriously. And a retired military pilot by the name of Ryan Graves is now making some progress in interviewing mostly military pilots, I understand, but I think commercial as well, to again carry on this work of flight safety, but at the same time collecting valuable scientific information that we can learn more about the phenomena.
Yeah, thank you. This is so interesting. I've studied a wide range of different types of encounters, and with close encounters of the third kind or the fourth kind, when they see some kind of being, they're in this state of like ontological shock, right? It's like reality is totally different. It just they've seen something that just doesn't fit in with the picture of reality that they had. And I think what you're describing is that many pilots who have these experiences are going through that ontological shock too. They saw something that seemed to be physically impossible, and as you said, many of them there's some kind of communication or there's some kind of signs of intelligence. So it's this possibility of also an intelligence emerging, uh that until then may not have been within the parameters of their worldview, and that can be really just like existentially disruptive, right? It's just like the understanding of how the world fit together is kind of shattered, right? And you have to rebuild it. um so going back to this question of the idea of these UAP as threats to aviation safety, I want to dig into this a little bit, because I think a lot of what's going on with disclosure right now, there's a lot of emphasis on this idea that UAP are a potential threat, to human safety, human welfare, national security threat, and things like that. But as you pointed out, when people have acted aggressively towards UAP, they've not acted aggressively back, right? You say maybe they paralyzed somebody or something like that to stop, and that's consistent with what I've read about that in instances where military personnel fired at the UAP or something. The UAP does not fire back, right? It may deflect the missiles, sometimes it dissolves them or something, but it
Mhm.
doesn't respond aggressively.
Yeah.
So when you are talking about threat, Can you just clarify for our viewers that that doesn't necessarily imply that, any kind of particular malicious intent from the UAP, or, just clarify a little bit of what you mean when you say that these are threats to aviation safety.
Okay, sure. Give you some examples.
Okay.
When you're flying an airplane, you have to be in control at all times in 3 dimensions, plus time, which is fourth, okay? Because you're going forward over time. Um, if you lose control, you got a problem. Then the question is, can you recover? Do you lose control for so long that you really, like in a tailspin, you got a real problem? Or, okay, when your instruments fail because of an electromagnetic influence, we believe is originating in the phenomenon at some distance, you got a problem. Why? Because you depend upon those instruments to fly the airplane, to maintain altitude and direction and speed and vertical rate and so forth. But there's another dimension as well, and that's I would call distraction. If you are flying along day or night and you happen to notice a light outside the cockpit that wasn't there previously, and it's keeping up with you in your speed and direction, your attention is immediately drawn out the cockpit to that object for lots of reasons. Safety reasons for one, but curiosity being another. That loss of attention is very, very important from a safety point of view. You can't afford to stop scanning your instruments, which you should do as a good pilot all the time, to maintain navigation. It's called avigation, actually. There's 3 principles of flying: avigation, navigation, and communication. So this is the first of those. And the second, too, with the navigation. So there's another aspect of safety in this regard, and that is air turbulence. What airplanes require a fairly stable environment, atmospheric environment. And if you're landing a heavy, any commercial jet into Denver Airport, at Denver International, on certain days, there's something called wind shear. I don't know if you know what that is.
I don't.
Okay. Wind shear refers to levels of wind in one direction and traveling wind in another direction at a higher altitude or a low altitude. Okay. And the difference between them is a shear. If you set your equipment to land the airplane and particularly throttle and power setting to manage wind at landing, which is very important closer you get to the ground, if you should go through a wind shear on the process of coming down to land, people have died, particularly in Denver, Colorado, because of the Rockies, the mountains right there, their tendency for more wind shear. Well, that's my point about turbulence. What if the phenomenon produces a turbulence, like wake turbulence at altitude, for instance? I've experienced this myself as a passenger in the back of the airplane, going somewhere across the country, and all of a sudden there's a sudden jolt. And I'm sure some of your viewers have had this happen too. What's happened is the pilot would come on the intercom and he'd say, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we've just passed through the wake turbulence of another flight that is at our altitude ahead of us somewhere, or behind us, for instance, probably ahead." And so that wake turbulence caused this tremendous up or down movement of our airplane, tossed like this. The question then is, does the phenomenon produce a turbulence of some kind? Which, if it does, that raises all kinds of important scientific aerodynamic questions. But it could induce a safety issue in the cockpit. So we have attention, electromagnetics, flight control for turbulence, and distraction.
All right, absolutely. Um, so I mean it's just all of, I think what you're really good at articulating is, all of the factors that go into flying an airplane that we kind of take for granted as passengers. We're just like sitting back there hanging out, and it's like so many things have to be paid attention to, right? And so many things are working together for the flight experience. And
Right,
so the presence of the phenomenon there can interfere with a wide range of things that are important
right,
for
right,
a safe flight.
right.
Um, so let me also ask you, this just came to my mind as you were speaking about this. I've heard about, Lou Elizondo has talked a little bit about some like military pilots reporting like time anomalies, like gaps of missing time while they were flying. Have you encountered that with commercial pilots at all?
No, I
No.
no. Honestly, in all my years of doing this research, I've never had that. It's a good question, and I usually ask it. It's not part of my protocol.
Okay.
I have like a 10-page form to fill out on each case with each pilot. And I didn't put that in. I guess that's a bias on my part. A pilot, if he loses time, there's a real problem.
Right.
The whole space-time continuum has got a break in it, right?
Right.
Okay. No, I didn't.
Okay, okay. So that was just out of curiosity. So, um, another question, and I genuinely, this is something that interests me, and I don't know the answer. Many times individuals who just have, see a UAP from the ground, or who have, a close encounter of the second or the third kind, there's the initial encounter, and then there's the aftermath of the encounter. And there's not just the ontological shock, but sometimes they report that strange things start happening in their lives in the aftermath, right? Strange coincidences, or psychic phenomena or other anomalous things start happening in their lives.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I don't know if you've encountered, have you spoken with pilots who, after they had their initial encounter in the air, that strange things started happening in the aftermath?
Hmm. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Now, I have an opposite of that.
Okay.
And in fact, I wrote an article in a British journal on this years and years ago. I think it was a DC-10 flying across the country from West Coast to East Coast, and he's over Lake Michigan. And he turns out, I interviewed him because of the sighting he had right there, but don't fast forward, but go fast back, maybe 3 or 4 months, when I had invited him to be a test pilot in a project at NASA to fly a simulator. And during that time, when I asked him this pregnant question, have you ever seen anything? He looked at me and he kind of smiled and he said, I know what you're talking about. No, I've never seen anything and I never will.
Hmm.
Okay. And I said, well, what's your flying background? Well, he was a Marine pilot in Korea, a combat pilot in Korea. And so he said, I don't want to take your form. I would hand out a form to some of these guys to take along with them. I said, okay, you've never seen one, but would you take this in your briefcase just in case?
Right.
You might not see it, but you'll be flying with somebody. Do me a favor and
Pass it
hand
along.
him the form. And then I'd collect some data that way. Well, come to find out, Phil was his first name, Philip. Philip said, no, I've never seen anything like this, and I never will, and I don't want to take your form. But he finally did. I think just to leave my office. I
Right.
wouldn't let him go without doing it. So time goes by, I think about 9 months, 6 or 7, 8 months, something like that. He calls me on the phone. He says, Dr. Haynes, you'll never believe what just happened to me. We've got to talk. His experience over Lake Michigan was a conversion experience. You talk about a religious conversion. He
Wow.
went from a total non-believer to a total believer in about 20 seconds because of what happened. So that's the opposite of what you're asking. Okay.
He went to being a total believer in UFO phenomena, or
Yes,
okay.
absolutely. He thought he was going to collide with this huge disk
Wow.
at altitude, coming at him at a high rate of speed, doing a high G turn. We calculated, I don't know, 20 Gs or something like that, and then going back in the direction at which it had come. And he was just as convinced as can be. I said, Phil, how big do you think that object was? And he looked at me and he said, it was at least as big as a football stadium.
Wow.
50,000 people, whatever. Huge, just
It's
huge.
huge.
He drew pictures of it for me. I always have pilots draw me a sketch, as crude as it might be. And by the way, they're not very crude usually, they're usually quite precise. He drew this beautiful oblate spheroid, which is your typical shape, of course, spherical shape, not spherical, a spheroid, with circles, black circles along its circumference, and so forth. So that's a long-winded explanation. No, I don't have any cases like that where
Sure.
and the reason is, I think, because they're so busy flying,
Right.
and I'm so busy going on with my work, we just don't meet up again. So there could be cases like that. I just don't know.
That yeah, that makes sense. That you may not follow up with them in the aftermath in that way. So, um, yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. So, and going back to a moment, just your CE5 research, and I want to talk just a little bit about the connection. You brought up Stephen Greer, and there are these CE5 events now that people take part in. Where they go out into the field and they perform a meditation. Set this intention. I want to have contact,
Mhm.
and sometimes things do appear, right? I mean, sometimes there's like an orb, or there's like they report these flashing lights in the sky and things like that. And I've attended some of these events myself. I'm willing to say that. And every now and then, to be honest, if I'm being candid, in most of my experiences nothing happens, but occasionally something does. um so, what's your take as a research scientist on these events where, people go out in these groups and they're putting out the intention, and then, something appears that either confirms their expectations, or maybe it thwarts their expectations depending on what they were thinking they were going to see. And how do you think that those types of CE5s relate to, the types that you've studied, of the communication that's initiated by humans?
Boy, that's a big one.
I
That
did. I'm sorry.
too many questions all at once.
Okay, so let me back it up. Just what's first of all, what's your general take on those experiences, the CE5s where people go and put the
Yeah.
intention out? What do you
Well,
what do you think?
I can't answer objectively because I
Right.
don't live within their skin.
Yeah.
Um, on the other hand, I have to say, based upon my experience in working with people who had encounters to some extent, not like John Mapp, nothing to his extent, but
Sure.
to some extent, I'm not going to call a pilot um, by a screwy name just because he comes forward with a weird story.
Right.
Likewise, I'm not going to say someone's prevaricating, making up a story, hallucinating, just because they come forward with a strange story. I can't do that. I have to let the data speak for itself. And what this requires at my end is faith. Without faith, I would eliminate everything because it didn't fit my mm, criteria, if you will,
Sure.
my upbringing in science and so forth. Um, and so I have to have faith that there's a a wider range, if you will, of experiences. And we don't know what another person experiences, to
Yep.
be very honest. So, so to be a therapist, for instance, or a counselor, helping a person through this experience, um, requires a great deal of not just patience and sensitivity and willing to listen, but a lot of faith.
Hmm.
Otherwise, we would be, not we, the counselor would be misrepresenting himself or herself, the phenomena, and the client, all at the same time, misrepresenting. And if we want to get to the bottom of this, we can't do that. We have to listen very carefully. And I think Dr. Mack was good at that. I knew him years ago, and I was very impressed with his sensitivity to listen. We've got to listen a lot more than we talk, if that makes sense. Did that come close at all to?
No, I really like that. I really like that, to be honest. I think I I I think a healthy skepticism is normal, but I really like what you said. We need to listen more, and we need to stop drawing these lines and saying, no, you couldn't possibly have experienced that, because they're reporting it because that was their lived experience, right?
Right,
And
right.
again, we don't have to jump to a conclusion that it was necessarily an alien spacecraft or something like that, but they observed something and it was meaningful for them. And, and I like what you said, we can be scientific, or we can be rigorous, or we can be scholarly, but we just also need to be, I think, humble, right? And step
Yes,
back and
yes.
not
Let me
dismiss any particular testimony.
let me continue a little bit
Yeah,
along a
absolutely.
slightly different line. That is one thing to talk about the individual witness, but when we have group
True.
witnesses, that
Yeah.
raises a whole nother mishmash of challenges, I must say. Um, and so when Stephen Greer calls a group together to go out into the nighttime sky of the desert and look up and all send a message, I have a problem with that. And I really do. And the problem, I've told him this.
Okay.
I've told him this. I wrote it in the CE5 book at the end of the book. And the problem is trying to achieve coherence.
Yeah.
You understand how a laser works, basically. It's coherent light. The photons that are emitted by the emitter of the laser itself are all lined up, so to speak, marching in the same cadence, in the same direction. That's why the beam doesn't spread without a lens. Well, this coherent factor, he's assuming that the human brain of all these participants sitting around the campfire or wherever they are going to be emitting a message to come down and visit us, please, all at the same time in the same way to achieve coherence. And I could argue I think convincingly that that's impossible. The
Mm.
EEG patterns are so different, and that's just the EEG. That's the surface, right? Not anything else. It's if it's coherent, it's a totally different coherence than I'm familiar with.
Sure.
So that's the first part of my answer to multiple groups. Um, as any lawyer, trial lawyer in accident cases will tell you, witnesses will all come up with slightly different or very different stories of what happened, right?
Sure.
And based upon that difference, they win their case oftentimes if they're prosecuting attorney. If you're a defense attorney, you have the opposite challenge to show there's coherence,
Right.
that those different stories are all of the same event. They match the same event. And that's what the attorneys have to cope with, basically. From a science point of view, I'm a skeptic about coherence
Okay.
in this CE5 application. I
Sure.
have to admit that. Um, and maybe I can get over that. Maybe somehow I'll change my mind. But right now, I'm a skeptic in that. Um, that's not to say that the group didn't see something.
Sure.
The question is, how coherent was what they saw? Did they all see the same thing, or was it an ambiguous stimulus that could be interpreted in different ways?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really fair answer, right? And I think that's a really just critical answer, like being open, but also, being introducing that healthy skepticism into the conversation too, that I think is important.
Okay, good, good.
As I said, even though I participate in them, I have a little bit of skepticism about it too, even being a participant. Eh, so um, I think that there hasn't been much systematic research on the CE5 types that Stephen Greer is doing. I'm very interested actually to get I want to order your book on the CE5 research that you did and just read through some of those cases, because that sounds incredibly interesting, and I'd
Mhm.
love to bring that more into the conversation.
I think you'll be surprised at what's there. I think you will. It's fascinating. I
Yeah,
was fascinated because I set out not thinking there were any cases like that.
right,
And the more I looked, I found it in many, many countries of the world, which tells me it's not cultural, it's not ethnic, it's not age related, it's not religion, it's not the political system, it's not. What it is human. You
right.
see, that's what we all have in common
Mhm.
across the world. And so this book really opened my eyes. And you're right, a lot more research needs to be done on this.
I mean, I think what you just said now is so important in terms of the phenomenological method, because there's so often this desire to reduce the witness testimony, as you said, to just being, oh, it's something cultural, or it's something political, or this, that, and the other. And and what you're showing is that these types of experiences are transcending, any particular cultural context, and they're reporting similar phenomena, even though they're in very different coming from very different backgrounds, very different locations. And that's significant, right? That's telling us something about kind of the essence or the nature of what they're seeing.
Well,
And
it tells us something about the nature of human beings. I think we're very largely fear based.
right.
Our responses are very often based upon fear rather than love.
Right, sure, sure. You mean those aggressive responses, those,
Yeah, right.
yeah, absolutely,
True
absolutely.
anomalous phenomena.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That kind of fear-based response to the anomalous, and yeah, reacting in a hostile
Mhm.
way.
Right.
Absolutely. I see what you're saying. So, Dick, you've been at this a very long time, much longer than I have, and so I have great respect for your work. And I'm just wondering, as this UFO UAP conversation is, becoming more mainstream. There's more academics, more folks in the government who are talking about this. Do you have any advice, from your many years of studying, or just anything that you'd like to impart, to me or to the viewers?
Oh boy, that's another good question. Keep them coming. Well, I have to think about that. I think my answer would be different for each person I'm talking to,
Okay.
just because of individual differences. But let's go back to fear-based behavior.
Okay.
Many of us don't cope very well with fear,
I agree.
and we do irrational things, behaviors, which we shouldn't do. Um, and so I think that controlling fear would be one of the first steps I would do. Why? Because we don't deal with ambiguity very well. We assume it's dangerous or offensive or whatever, rather than looking at it as just another aspect of reality or fantasy, whatever, uh, that we don't have to get afraid of. Does
Right.
that make sense?
It does.
That might be one of my early recommendations. I was going to say be educated as much as you can about
Okay.
this, and I'm not sure that's too important.
Hmm.
I hate to say that, but education and intellect are different from emotional response.
Right.
They're different domains, I think. I'd hate to have to prove that. And there's a subject for research right there. Difference between intellect and emotion. But having said that, I know a lot of very bright people, very intelligent, educated people who are as closed-minded as you'd ever want to find.
I know something like that too.
Yeah, and closed-minded people are not the kind of people that ought to be studying this phenomenon. You've got to keep
I agree.
the lid's off. Pandora's box has been
It's
opened.
open.
We're not going to close it.
I agree.
And so keep the door open to creative approaches, ideas, analyses, interpretations. And I've got to say that from my own life experience point of view, and I'm getting older now, I've come to believe that there is a God in the universe who's infinitely creative. That's one of his characteristics, his creativity. And he's created life in outer space, and he's created life on this planet, and he kind of leaves them alone, I think, maybe to see how they come out. But here's the point. That human beings on our planet have a space program. And I've had the privilege of contributing a little bit to ours, in the past at least. So we have a space program that's sending vehicles far out now. They're beyond the solar system. And they're very crude by large standards. But what if God has created intelligent beings on other planets with their own space programs and curiosity and so forth, and they're sending their vehicles out just like we are, but they're 1 million years older than we are.
Right.
Or whatever. They've gotten here first. We'll get there eventually. We might even pick up an image en route as they pass. That would be wonderful. I don't think that's happened yet, frankly, but maybe it has, and NASA hasn't told us.
It's true, right?
So I guess my point is that let's be patient. Let science work. Be willing to let science develop a whole new branch. I don't know what we'll call it, but it'll be a mix of psychosocial understandings and physics, nuclear physics, particle physics, chemistry, metallurgy. It should bring all
of it together.
areas together in a whole new branch of science, and religion too. Don't forget religion.
I want to pick up on that last point, because I think that's so interesting that you brought religion in there too, because the more that I study these experiences, the more that I see they kind of walk the line between, or they kind of blur the line between, like, the religious and the scientific. And it's like you kind of need to look through the lens of both in order to understand them, and maybe dissolve these boundaries between science and religion that is so prominent in our society. Would you agree with that? That we need to stop trying to separate the religious and the scientific, and kind of under a more holistic worldview that would encompass both at once?
Yeah, all I can say is amen.
Amen. Okay.
No, I think you're exactly right.
Okay.
In my career, many, many times people have wanted me to be forced into a continuum, at one end of a continuum called nuts and bolts,
Right.
where the UAP is really a metallic craft with instruments on board and flight guidance and propulsion and stuff the way we would do it.
Yeah.
At the other end of that same continuum is the spiritual.
Yes.
And they want to force me into one of those
One or the
dimensions,
others.
far out at one end or far out in the other end. And I will resist that, because from a science objective point of view, I want to have the privilege of staying somewhere in the middle of between those two extremes, to let the data speak for itself. And if that evidence suggests that it's spiritual, then I'm going to be out there. I'm going to really accept that UFO turn out to be fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy of the end times. I just open that as a possibility as a Christian. On the other hand, if we capture a saucer someday and we get to look at it and I can touch it and so forth, then I'll be at the other end of that spectrum. But that doesn't deny the existence of the spiritual end. It doesn't go away, it's
I
still
agree.
there. And so, again, just as a courtesy, I'd like to be afforded the opportunity to stay in the middle.
And I think that's so important because you're correct. They want I think they try to force us into one box or another. You know, I'm a philosopher, so they sometimes I've been kind of shoved into the box on the other end that I'm looking at it through just the religious or the spiritual lens. And I don't want to look at it through just that lens, but I think that that lens is very important, right? I think that's an aspect of it that we can't ignore. I also think the physical things and the instruments, and as you said, you know, the nuts and bolts is part of it too. And that's a little bit of what I've tried to do on this program is look at the whole phenomenon, right? Because when we use phenomenology and we look at everything that appears, it's both. It's a physical phenomenon with interests, or sorry, with instruments and a material reality to it, and it's a spiritual phenomenon too. That kind of, you know, that there's just aspects of it that go beyond the material and go beyond the instruments and have to do with you know, these profound spiritual transformative things that people go through. um and you know, Diana Pasulka's work, so many people who study this, you know, might have a religious conversion or you know, just see some kind of sacred elements to what's going on, and I think that's part of it too. And so I think when we look at the full phenomenology, it's a both and, right? It's not one or the other. It's
Yeah.
looking at looking at all the angles and the a holistic perspective. So I'm
Yes.
really
Hey,
happy to hear you say that.
Kim, I'm delighted at the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, you're keeping the flame going, alive, let's say, in the hearts and the minds of your viewers. And that's very valuable. It's very important to do that because that flame could go out. We could enter a dark age again.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
some believe that we are already, but I don't believe that myself.
No, me neither.
That's a question of faith. But nonetheless, I encourage you to continue doing that, to educate, but more importantly, to encourage. And I think that's what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I plan to keep going, and I really appreciate your words of encouragement. And I really have enjoyed this conversation. I don't have any more questions, but I've really enjoyed speaking with you today, and I hope that our viewers have enjoyed this conversation too. Any final thoughts that you want to leave folks
Well,
with?
I've enjoyed it very much too because you got so many good questions.
Great. I am so
Yeah.
glad.
And I would look forward again to the
All
opportunity
right.
to chat with you.
Absolutely. I would love
Okay.
to have you on here again. So,
Okay.
thank you once again to our viewers. This concludes another episode of a Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies. I am the host, Kimberly Engels. And once again, this was Dr. Richard Haynes signing off. Thank you.